Welcome to the Intrinsically Ordered podcast. Today I'm joined by Brandon Robertson, who's one of the leading progressive Christian voices who I listened to a ton when I was deconstructing a traditional view of sexuality. Today I'm joined by him to talk about his new book, Queer and Christian, and we're going to be going through both a pragmatic discussion around the queer and the Christian movement, and then a little bit more on the theological and ontological side. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been listening to this show since it's come out, and I love the work you're doing, and your story is so relatable, so compelling, and I'm just glad to be here to chat with you.
Well, I appreciate it so much. And I've listened to a lot of your content, so I'll be asking some more in-depth questions. But for people that may not have heard of you, could you kind of give that elevator pitch of what's your story and what are you about before we dive into the deep end?
Yeah, totally. I come from the conservative evangelical world. I had a conversion when I was about 12, similar to your story in many ways, and dove headfirst into studying to be a pastor from 12 years old through this year, probably. But over that journey, of course, my faith began to deconstruct when I was in college. I went to a school in Chicago and just walked outside the four walls of our Bible college and began to see all the ways that my faith didn't align with the world. And I found God, as I would say, in all the places that God wasn't supposed to be according to our theology. And at that same time was wrestling with my own sexuality, and my college required me to do a year of conversion therapy and had all of those experiences of just being met with fear after fear after fear by people who were afraid of a young Christian exploring different kinds of views of what it meant to be a Christian. And after that, I've been involved in a decade now of LGBT scholarship from the Christian perspective, and also activism for LGBT rights in various arenas. And today I'm a pastor here in New York City, and I'm pursuing a PhD in queer biblical studies. So we'll see where that goes. But yeah.
Well, that is an exciting journey to be on. One of the things, so coming from a Catholic background, I was just listening to your dialogue with a Catholic right before this. And one of the things that I kind of saw his face drop at was you saying that God can work through a number of religions, a number of belief systems, that he's kind of present in all things. How do you view God, or should I say, who is God / what is God?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, it's remarkable that said Catholic was surprised by that, because that's actually Catholic theology 101 in at least many strands of Catholicism. And I learned that from my mentor, Father Richard Rohr, who has written a lot about God being found in many different traditions and places. But when I talk about God, I identify as a Christian agnostic, meaning that I embrace the Christian tradition as a frame through which I can speak and think about the world, and the stories and rituals help me to kind of order my life and my world. But I'm an agnostic in that I don't know that God exists. I think about God in kind of the broad, open theistic worldview of kind of the ground of being, life itself, reality itself, the cause, the uncaused cause, I think is the way that some folks put it. But for me, God is an experience. God is a thing I hope for. It's a thing that gives me a sense of purpose and meaning. I'm not going to ever say that I'm sure that God exists, or I'm sure that any of the doctrines or beliefs of Christianity are objectively true, because I think it's quite obvious that we can't know that any of that is true. That's why humans ask these questions over and over again every generation. So
one of the things that I've always been puzzled by when especially hardline Christian apologists make these broad claims about God being necessary, God being true, is like, I'm unsure what it means for religion to be true when it's pitted against it's just as true as science. When you say that you are a Christian, that you belong to the tradition, it sounds more like you found a tradition that works, something that's beautiful from a metaphorical side, versus this, like, I can prove you kind of line by line that God is more true, or presuppositional theology. Am I hearing you correct with that?
Yeah, and this will probably catch some people off guard and might get me in trouble, but I actually think that, like, how Jordan Peterson talks about Christianity is how I feel about my Christianity, that it's from kind of a Jungian kind of metaphorical perspective, that the myths of this tradition, the stories of the Christian and Jewish tradition, have become the basis of Western consciousness in many ways, and they do matter. They do have some great depth to them. They do have some really helpful ways to help us analyze our own journeys, our own psychology, our own spirituality. I'm also, of course, open to all of the other ways that we can think about those things. I'm a devotee of Albert Camus and kind of the absurdist philosophical tradition as well, and I deeply resonate with that world. And I just think the problem with kind of fundamentalism and orthodoxy in general is that it's just so limiting. It limits God, it limits human exploration, and it forces dishonesty, because even the people that are the most certain, I just can't believe at their depth of depth, core of core, that they can go to bed at night and know for a fact that the things that they assert are true are actually true, because empirically, there's no way to prove that they're true. And it just feels like a psychological mechanism to help them have certainty in the world. And I get that, and that's okay if you need that, but it's ultimately not a verifiable truth, and it's a very limiting way to live in the world.
That's a great point on Peterson. I just put something out there about that Jordan Peterson, reading especially his old books, Maps of Meaning, was integral for me deconstructing traditional Catholicism, in that all of these advantages, all of these benefits, all of these interpersonal improvements that my life had through religion, when I read Jordan Peterson's work, he was able to deconstruct them in a way that didn't require this fundamentalist view of the world, or a presuppositional view of the world, in that the world isn't just a plane of existence, a forum for action, that we have all of these myths that we've constructed that are integral for us moving through the world, and that the Christian myth in a certain way has a certain set or a certain metaphorical substrate that we all exist within. Would you say that your thinking around this issue has updated throughout the years?
Yeah, I mean, that's also a weird question, because of course it has, but it also hasn't. I go back and read, I wrote my first book, Nomad, 10 years ago, and I go back and read it. And though the way I talk about Christianity, and of course the mind space that I was in, is different, I still like some of the basic Christian doctrines, at least from a Protestant perspective, of grace, the metaphor of Eucharist, of breaking open our bodies and pouring out ourselves for the good of others. Like, that stuff has remained really consistent for me as helpful metaphor, helpful ways to think and live in the world. What certainly has evolved is I used to be a dogmatic fundamentalist who needed certainty in order to function in the world. And once I stepped out beyond the boundaries of kind of Orthodox Christianity and was able to experience what I think is the Spirit of God, so to speak, that blows like the wind. Jesus talks about the Spirit as the wind that blows and no one knows from where it comes or where it goes. That's just a much more compelling and exhilarating way to live, and has freed me to be a more honest human, to be a better pastor, because I don't stand up on Sundays thinking I'm declaring God's truth, but I'm offering questions and things for people to think through. And it feels like a more helpful way to be in the world.
I was listening to another one of your interviews with a large Christian radio show that they could not stop interrupting you and going, and without this dogmatic view of the world, that we're just stardust and life doesn't have meaning. But what I find interesting is when we get beyond this emotional gut reaction to the fact that we might be stardust, that we might have to be out in the world and construct and analyze our worldviews versus inheriting this one that we hold to with all certainty, that when we release ourselves from having that dogmatic view of the world, we get to reconstruct what we care about versus what has like capital M meaning out there in the world. What do you think that gut reaction that Christians have, or especially dogmatic Christians have, when their worldview is questioned, and they almost seem to dig down harder as soon as you make them question their presuppositions? They double down harder that without this, my life's going to completely collapse. What do you think that emotional reaction is, and how do you confront that in a conversational approach, not in kind of gotcha style debates?
Yeah. I mean, the truth is, if they do confront these questions, their worldview will collapse. And that is a very scary thing. And so I do have a great deal of empathy for a lot of the folks that I do interact with who have a fear-based view of the world, that they have to hold on to the right theology or else eternal hell is the consequence. But even beyond that, as you stated, a meaningless life is what they're afraid of. And that's something that's natural to be afraid of. But as much as I debate, the one thing that I also learned very early on is that these debates actually don't do anything. They don't change anyone's mind. The way I've seen people's hearts and minds change, the way my heart and mind was changed, was not through somebody giving me a really good argument. It's people experiencing a queer Christian in the world, or an agnostic in the world, or an atheist in the world that actually does live a meaningful life, that actually does value truth, goodness, and beauty, and like cultivates a sense of wonder and awe in the world without God or without religion. That's what actually is going to change people's minds. And so I enter these debates primarily because conservatives live in this space. And so if you're going to try to speak and help and move along some folks that are kind of stuck in a very narrow worldview, you got to enter into those arenas. But I never actually go in thinking I'm going to win a debate. First of all, these conservatives are experts at the art of debate. And second of all, it's not about the argument for me. Like, I do think the best arguments are towards the kind of more agnostic open view for sure. But that's not ultimately, I think, for most people, what changes their minds. And if I can offer a more compassionate presence in the space of somebody who's dogmatically pushing against me and saying that I'm a threat to their worldview, I hope that that will pique someone's mind and be like, oh, maybe this guy who is my enemy is not actually my enemy. Maybe there is something more here. At least that's what I try to embody in those spaces.
That's something I've thought about too, in that, like, I don't think a single YouTube video will get some dogmatic Catholic to fundamentally change their worldview because they heard some argument from me and they just all of a sudden drop their faith. I find that a lot of, at least my content and the work that I've been doing, has been giving people permission who are starting to question. We're like, maybe this isn't the best way to live life. Maybe this isn't the fullness of the truth. Finally giving them permission to, let's analyze, or let's deconstruct, or let's reevaluate the worldview that I have, and start really questioning things and starting to rebuild a life. Is that kind of a similar goal that you hope that your content has?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say, like, your video on joining the Catholic cults, like, that was one of my first interactions with you, but, like, so compelling just to hear your own kind of psychological processing of your journey and where you were at and what led you into that kind of worldview. And obviously I could relate. I joined a fundamentalist Baptist church when I was 12, and, like, I had that same journey. And I just, obviously, storytelling and, like, having the space to analyze our own journeys in public with authenticity is what's helping people. That's what's connecting with people. Sure, again, like, I think having really brilliant conversations and deep arguments about things that matter is important. But ultimately, people are connecting with your authenticity, your story, your own journey, and seeing that where you are today is not the scary place that the Catholic Church or the evangelical world says you're going to end up when you walk away. And yeah, that's what I try to embody when I say I'm a progressive Christian agnostic. Like, no, I don't worship Satan now, and my life has not fallen apart, and I'm actually doing pretty well. So if people can see that, I feel like it liberates them to have the permission to step outside.
What keeps you using the term Christian, in that you've deconstructed many of these large beliefs, and that even there's some vile Christians out there that might rebuke you as some sort of crazy apostate? I think that faith should always be done on somebody's own terms. But what keeps you using that Christian label, especially when you've recognized or deconstructed some of these harmful past Christian beliefs from kind of the tech or from the history books?
Yeah, I mean, there's a strategic answer and then kind of like a personal answer, right? The strategic answer is because I don't think that Christianity should be conceded to these conservative, dogmatic, and oftentimes very harmful people. Christianity will continue to be a dominant religion and a dominant force in the world throughout my lifetime. And it's growing in many parts of the world in some concerning ways and in some beautiful ways. And so I think it's really important that we lean into Christianity's own tradition of reforming. This exists in all branches of Christianity, this desire to keep changing and evolving doctrines and theologies and ways of showing up in the world. Would be honored to get to be a small part of whatever modern reformation is taking place. But also, I'm a historian in some senses. Like, a lot of the PhD work that I'm doing is focused on first century Judaism and the birth of Christianity, and recognizing that early phase of Christianity, which compels so many people, has nothing to do with Christianity as it stands today, or as it's stood for about 1,500 years. The early Jesus movement was a radical socio-political Jewish spiritual movement that I think looks a lot more like queer activist communities that I'm a part of today than any church that exists. And so I do feel authentically Christian. I do try to model my life after the person of Jesus as I understand him from the Gospels. And I'm also not, I think there's a power to being able to stand up to a Catholic apologist with some great authority, or evangelical apologist with authority, and say, you don't get to own this. Like, there is space for folks like me. And there's always been space for folks like me in the Christian tradition. And yeah, but I also completely understand the folks that walk away from it. And believe me, I've considered that and do consider that many times, because there's the other side of it, which is, especially in the Catholic tradition, reform is really hard and very unlikely on most things in the Catholic tradition. And so to walk away makes a good deal of sense.
What I found, or something that I frequently say, is that the tragedy of the queer and the Christian debate is that the conservative side says that you have to pick one. And I think in any queer space or in any deconstructing space, that nobody is opposed to somebody holding on to the label of Christian or to reinvent faith on their own terms. And it really is only one side of the aisle that says you have to pick. I got a comment the other day that was saying, are you saying that Christian or that gay people have to leave the faith? Because that can be just as tragic as a Christian saying you have to leave the faith. I said, no, the real tragedy is that the other side is making you, or is forcing you to make a decision. I think faith should always be done on your own terms, whether to do it or how to do it or in what context. When you're talking to somebody who's wanting to deconstruct, or maybe they've emotionally left, but they still feel stuck in their thought patterns and are so scared to make that first step to deconstructing, what advice do you give them on that deconstruction journey as they're almost rebuilding their life from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, the first step on the actual deconstructing part is it's going to be as scary as you think it is. It's going to be as traumatic as you think it is. And I just feel like there were not a lot of people in my world at the time that were being completely honest and transparent about how big of a deal it is for you to go from believing in this very orderly way of how the world and universe works and your place in it to chaos and not having any sort of understanding of where you belong or what's going on in the world. That's going to be scary. And that's why I do think we're really lucky to live in a time where there are so many vast deconstruction type communities online and even in person that exist, where you can find fellow nomads on the journey outside of traditional faith, and community is essential. But also, the reconstruction is just as important as the deconstruction. And whether that's reconstructing a worldview that's non-religious or reconstructing a progressive or kind of new thought, new age, like whatever path you feel drawn to is very important. So don't wallow in the hatred of the lies and the abuse and the bigotry that you're coming from. There's a time for that. But I've seen far too many people get stuck in that posture and then never build or kind of evolve into a healthy, grounded way of being in the world, but just spend their energy in opposition. And I just don't think that's a helpful spiritual or psychological energy. And you can see how it becomes a re-traumatizing force in so many people's lives. And so I just really encourage people that I get to pastor one-on-one, like, yes, have your time of anger. Yes, lash out, do your activism against the church. You can continue to do that, but you want to make sure that the energy you're doing it is as somebody who's empowered, who's reclaimed their life, who has a sense of groundedness in their own life in whatever way makes sense for you, and not just as somebody who's been hurt and is kind of functioning out of woundedness. It's not a life-giving space. And I think wherever we end up, we want to have a good, a whole, a meaningful life. And you just can't do that when you're constantly deconstructing every aspect of everything in your life.
I think the hard part about deconstructing from a Christian perspective is that you have to think your way through an issue before you can experience the lived reality of that. In that, Christians will say or a hardline Christian will say, without God, there's no inherent meaning to everything. And then you kind of have this gut emotional reaction versus you can spend time and think through, what would life look like? How would I live if there wasn't inherent meaning? And you get to experience that. And then you can try out kind of the different belief and the different faith hats from there. You can experience realities or experience emotions versus this gut emotional reaction that I can't feel that or can't explore that. And then you can move through life instead of this, I'm stuck in my theological library before I can even live life to begin with.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that's one of the gifts in my own life. I don't know why I was wired this way, but I've never been afraid to try on different worldviews. And even when I was a fundamentalist, I would cosplay in different worldviews. Like I was heavily influenced by Mormon missionaries in high school, even while I was a fundamentalist. I didn't tell my church about it, but like I was engaging with them and like trying to think of, oh, what would it look like if I lived this way? And that is a gift. I really do think Christians from conservative backgrounds need to overcome the fear that simply trying to believe a different set of propositions or a different way of viewing the world is not going to condemn your soul to hell. You're not going to be possessed by demons automatically. Your world's not going to fall apart. Like, it's my constant refrain. The thing that actually liberated me was that verse from First John that says, perfect love casts out all fear. If God is love and love casts out all fear, then whenever fear is present, God is not present. That was just a very helpful paradigm for me, because anytime I approach something with fear, I was immediately able to identify that this is not what I understand God to be. And if folks can get over the fear, which is a hard thing to do, and try on different worldviews, as you said, like, you'll find just how exhilarating the world can be. I put on my Albert Camus absurdist hat on a lot, and I can't live there because I do find some of that to be a little nauseating, like the anxiety that comes from a completely absurdist view of the universe. And it also has allowed me to discover that there is so much beauty, and it helps me relate to my atheist friends, of which I have, most of them are atheists, and see like, oh wow, they actually can have a meaningful life and think of the universe in a beautiful way, even if they don't believe that they're ultimately heading towards some eternal life or salvation. So yeah, trying things on is essential, but it takes a lot of work to be able to get over the fear to do that.
I've given a number of people the advice when they're doing the, should I join kind of the queer community? I always said, try it out, go for it. And the Christian community, your traditional church is always going to take you back if you have a cool testimony that they can then weaponize against other people. Like, these traditional churches will always take you back. So to take a few months, to take a year, to explore your queer identity, the worst that happens is you have a chapter of your life and you can go back to traditional religion, versus this, like, I have to think and I have to know everything about what it's like to join the queer community before I do it. When in reality, we're products of our own intellectual environments, and that by joining some of these communities, breaking bread with people who are queer, so much of that shame and that guilt and all of these big problems seem to melt away when you can just experience people that are having meaningful lives without the same dogmatic view of the world that you had. What advice would you give to somebody who's questioning traditional Christianity and exploring their queer identity to join the queer community, whatever that is?
I mean, I don't have much more to say than what you said, because that's honestly what changed my life. And what I tell people all the time is, like, I got born again in a gay nightclub. Like, there's this beautiful nightclub that no longer exists called Town in DC. That was this massive 2-floor queer nightclub. And it was the first place I went out as an openly queer person. Of course I was terrified. Of course I had all the stereotypes of what it was and what it was going to be for me that I learned from my conservative church. But you're exactly right. Like, being able to stand in a space with people just like me, many of whom who have similar journeys and their own religious trauma and could relate to what I was going through, and just experience freedom and the ability to enjoy myself and be weird and out there and fully who I am, opened so much within me. It was definitely like a spiritual awakening. And I'm still a queer bar club goer every weekend, because for me, they're sacred spaces where I constantly am surprised and delighted by the queer community. And so, again, it's the fear, though, that keeps even the folks that are on the edge of the closet and coming out. Yes, of course, if you go to the queer spaces I'm talking about, there are going to be drunken people. There's probably going to be somebody doing drugs. There's probably going to be some sexual things happening. That doesn't mean you have to do that. And also, that's happening in heterosexual spaces as well. Yes. And there's a lot of spaces for you to just experiment and explore. And queer people also, in general, have so much grace for folks on this journey. And so, yes, go explore. If the club's not your space, find a gay book club in your community. Find an LGBT community center that you can get involved with. Once you start connecting with the queer community, you'll find that a lot of them are much more Christ-like than the people that you're coming from in your conservative religion. And you'll get to experience what I believe true liberation and living into your true self actually feels like. And it's exhilarating.
I've found more good Samaritans and more prodigal fathers and more wonderful servants out there in the queer community. And I was amazed when I first started meeting other queer folks that they didn't have this dogmatic view of the world where every question was trying to figure out, what did I believe? I could just say, I don't know what I make about this religion or this gay thing. And they could just sit there with me, versus in some churches, you sit down in a pew and they start trying to figure out what you believe and then working you to their worldview, versus in the queer community, there's so much space for just, I don't know, I'm just figuring things out. I don't know what to call myself. I don't know what I believe. I don't know what I make of all of this. I'm just here. and people will accept you right where you are and answer questions, but without this, I got to make you, and I have all these perfect apologetic arguments about the 3 steps or whatever queer theology. It's just
Yeah.
people will sit with you in the queer community is something that just floored me versus in the Christian world.
Yeah. And the freedom of just not having to have it all figured out it's the best. I mean, it's truly
Yeah.
liberating because, again, you don't have it all figured out when you're a fundamentalist. You think you do, but when you have to keep denying science that you see everybody else in the world around you is believing in, and you just have to keep demanding that Genesis says the earth is 6,000 years old, like, that's just not a good space for your mind. It's not a good space for your soul. And I feel like most fundamentalists know that and feel that, which is why they respond with the fear that you were talking about earlier and the vitriol that they have, because they're so vulnerable, because it's a foundation built on sand.
I like your language of calling some of these queer spaces sacred, in that they became special places for me where I could say the words out loud, I'm gay, and not have to worry about 75% or 50% or 25% or some random person hating me for that. Unlike in some Christian spaces where you're so worried and you spend your whole life, your body's trying to figure out what will people think and will I be in danger? What will they think? Versus in queer spaces, it's nice to, it's a refreshing environment where everybody there has a similar story, that you know how everybody's going to react, and you saying I'm gay is the most normal thing about the entire night or about people's life experiences, and you get to move on versus kind of being scared of your own shadow, like in many Christian spaces. Maybe another question here is, for people that retain their faith, especially those that are starting to date or are starting to even start families, how should they go about navigating this faith that they want to belong to, where a certain percent is always going to disagree with them? How do they keep themselves, their partner, their kids safe in a religion that's kind of divided on this issue?
Yeah. I mean, it's a hard question because the truth is, as much progress as we've made, we've got a long way to go. We could be seeing a great reversion in many spaces in the United States, at least in relation to queer rights. Definitely anti-LGBT people will be empowered over the next 4 years. But the one thing that I harp on in the book and in every space I get to is a majority of mainline Christian denominations and a good handful of Catholic churches are open and affirming and fully accepting of LGBT people. We are in an era where, for Christianity at least, there is an explosion of thousands upon thousands of LGBT-inclusive churches. And so for folks who want to explore their faith, for folks who just want to raise their family in a religious environment for whatever reason, really amazing inclusive spaces do exist. And they exist in communities in the smallest town in Iowa and in New York City. And so I'm always surprised at how many queer people just don't know progressive religion exists. And again, my goal is not to convert people to progressive Christianity. I have no stake in that. Like, if you don't want to be part of the Christian church, I don't think you need to. But for those who do, we need to do a better job at letting them know that these spaces are here, and that every evangelical Lutheran church you go to, every United Church of Christ you go to, every Presbyterian Church USA you go to, every American Baptist church you go to is fully LGBT inclusive, is likely having queer people on staff, is likely going to have a Sunday school curriculum that teaches your kids sexual ethics that are actually grounded in science and reason in middle school and high school, rather than whatever crazy stuff you grew up hearing in church. These resources exist, and we have an incredible opportunity to reclaim faith if we want to. But of course, the dominant narrative of Christianity in the United States is going to continue to be anti-LGBT, frankly, because conservatives are better at marketing than progressives are. And we're going to have to navigate the issues of safety, the issues of helping children understand that they might go to school and interact with a fundamentalist young friend who says their parents are going to burn in hell. And there are great resources to help us teach our kids how to respond to those arguments and things like that. So I would just say, take stock of the great resources we have. Use websites like gaychurch.net that show thousands upon thousands of churches across this country that exist, and know that you're on the side of the way that the tide is turning. I don't think that queer rights are ultimately going to roll back. We're ultimately going to create a more inclusive society. The writing's on the wall. And so I think we should be empowered and not allow fear to get the best of us.
I know many conservatives get very pressed over having gay pride flags outside of churches, but from what I've seen, they tend to be a beacon of hope, where you know that everybody in that congregation knows that there's a pride flag when they walk through the door, or it's on the church, or it is somewhere. and you can know something about the people that attend there because they walk past that flag, versus, especially for newer Christians or maybe even Christians who aren't super theologically educated, a lot of these middle of the road churches can be so incredibly deceiving with their language. And there's so much doublespeak, and there's so much language that they know points one direction to attract the queer community, but once you get there, then they turn you in a different direction. I think that a church that has a pride flag outside that proudly displays it is probably a sign that they're actually affirming and not faux affirming, or affirming your identity as a beloved son of the Father and then insert why it's sinful. But I think that pride flag on a church really is a beacon of hope, that it's probably a safe place to end up.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I go back and forth on the performative nature sometimes of progressive churches. Like, I do think there is a way that some churches might overdo and like make queerness the identity. And most queer people that I know that go back into churches don't want a church where every week we're going to talk about queer stuff. But I also agree with you that, like, I think the pride flag doesn't actually even just refer to LGBT people anymore. I think it's a sign of the progressive values of a community. And like at our own community, we came up with not exactly a pride flag, but a sign that uses rainbow colors, that mentions people with disabilities, mentions people of color, mentions immigrants. And I do see a lot more kind of progressive religion moving in that direction, where we're very outwardly needing to tell people that these are our core values. And it is kind of a new orthodoxy in a different sense. Like, progressive churches center on marginalized experiences. That's what we're doing. And I think that also makes progressive churches, it's why we're never going to be packed out mega churches or big cathedrals like the conservative churches are, because we are saying that we are committed to diversity and voices that might make you uncomfortable. And that's not a very good way of growing a church, but it is a great place if you're trying to go and find healing, especially from religious trauma, which is how I see the role of most progressive communities, not as the last stop for people, but as a revolving door for people who have religious trauma to come back, to be healed of that trauma, to discover a different way of being Christian. And then like 75% of the people that come through the churches I've pastored, at least, end up leaving and not staying a part of progressive Christianity, not because they're hurt by it, but because they've spiritually, intellectually evolved, and it was a healing stop on their journey. And I think that's a great role for us to play as progressive religious communities.
How is it that you think that progressive Christianity and those who've deconstructed religion entirely can ally to fight against this new wave of especially the religious right in America?
Yeah, this is really compelling. I've been recently talking to a Satanist, which that's going to get me in trouble. But if anybody knows, like, the actual Temple of Satan idea is a bunch of people that are just atheists. They don't believe in a literal devil or a literal God. But their strategy is to kind of use this thing that trolls conservative Christians as a way to show them the flip side of the things that they're advocating for. For instance, putting up 10 commandments out front of a state capitol. Well, they argue, let's put up a Satan statue out there too, because religious pluralism. And then usually the 10 Commandments statue doesn't go up. But the conversation I've been having with this person is that there's so much that we can do together as progressive people of faith and kind of an atheist organization. And there are so many great organizations rising up to try to combat Christian nationalism. I think what we all agree on is that Christian nationalism is not Christian. I don't think the history of it has anything to do with trying to be faithful to Christ or to any sort of theology. It is, from its inception, a political movement meant to secure the power of white, heterosexual, cisgender, conservative people. And they use the guise of Christianity to do that. And I think we have such a rich history of progressive religious leaders in this country that have stood up and started massive movements that have reformed our country from the ground up. MLK Day is coming up. He's a great example of somebody to do that. But that only happened because he was willing to build broad coalitions with people that saw the world differently and were not aligned with his Baptist faith. It's nothing profound to say that we just need to set aside what I think is the downside of liberalism or progressivism in our country, which is we demand our ideological purity and have our own orthodoxies. We need to set that aside and say, what would it look like for the progressive Christian denomination to align with the Temple of Satan and the Freedom from Religion Foundation and form a united front and say, actually, we're more aligned on what we desire for our country than we are different. And Christian nationalism is big enough of a threat that it's time for us to set down all of our differences. And if we want to see democracy and if we want to see Christianity actually survive in any meaningful way in our country, Christian nationalism has to be confronted and defeated as the sham that it is.
I found that the religious right is so incredibly well organized, they're so incredibly well funded, they're so incredibly well connected, both on the social level, on the media level, on a governmental level. And you had mentioned earlier that you think the progressive movement is lacking in its marketing or its resources. And that's something I've been trying to think through as well. If you were in charge of the entire progressive movement and had the same billionaire oil money as the conservative movement, what would be your vision for the future of the progressive movement when it comes to messaging, media, and all that jazz?
We would start the Daily Wire and we would find our Jordan Peterson, we would find our Candace Owens, we would find our Joe Rogan. Because, I mean, to be honest, I find myself listening to them just because they're, obviously I don't agree with them, but there's a compellingness and honesty, a willingness to go there and talk about things that actual people are concerned about. And I think this past presidential election, like this is a read that many people are aware of, that progressive just lost the plot. We focused on some very important issues and very important communities, but we neglected a lot of people and we neglected a lot of the real issues that people want to talk about and need to have addressed. And so I just want us to do what you're doing, have high quality YouTube content going out there, have high quality media that's going across social media, that's not afraid to be honest, that's not afraid to have the hard conversation, that's not afraid to have disagreements and is not going to demonize one another because we see something differently. Because that's the only thing that I think the right has done that has helped solidify the MAGA base is Donald Trump is authentic. Donald Trump is who Donald Trump is. Donald Trump's going to say what Donald Trump thinks. And the average person just wants somebody who's not performing a part, but sharing their actual experience of the world. This is a critique of me too. Like, I don't always show up in these spaces as completely able to talk about all the things that I want to talk about and whatever, because we do fear transgressing progressive orthodoxy sometimes. And I just feel like we need to get rid of that and elevate diverse voices that are willing to share real experiences of the average person in the world. And I think we could really mobilize, I think, the majority of this country who is aligned with a progressive worldview and who is aligned with progressive causes. But we're just not doing that. We're not investing in the right kinds of media either.
Yeah, I mean, we are intellectual products of our intellectual environment, like I had said earlier. And I think the right has done a great job of the decentralized media, the non-legacy media, this new era. They're in the space. And I swear, especially within the Catholic movement, there's this push for individual content creators. And I swear every Catholic and their Catholic grandmas now have YouTube channels. My entire feed on my YouTube channel, I only watch Catholic content. And the number of new channels, it seems like everybody has a YouTube channel on their webcams. They can be 70, they can be 18. They're making a ton of content. And just by virtue of that, people are starting to pick up on that. And like we so need more independent progressive voices that are actually making media, because what people listen to is what people end up believing. And kind of the last note here is you have an upcoming book coming out in April. And you said this will kind of be the last of the things that you want to say about this issue. Tell us a little bit about what the book's about, and why you think this is your last push in that particular set of messaging.
Yeah, I mean, so the honest story behind the book is that I've written 3 books about reconciling your faith and sexuality before, and I was kind of done with that. I've said about as much as I thought I could say. And my publisher, I signed with a new publisher, and they said, well, we want you to write another book before we'll let you write the book that you really write, that you want to write. And the book that you write first has to be about queer Christian stuff because that's what you make content about. So I begrudgingly began this book, but throughout the writing process, it really became something I'm really proud of and became something that was healing for me because it's not just the same old, let's talk about the 6 clobber passages. That content is out there. Everyone can access that today. And I think that's a great thing. But my faith evolved greatly beyond reconciling with 6 clobber passages to becoming a fully queer person, a sex-positive person, an agnostic person, a very different kind of Christian than I was even when I just reconciled my faith and sexuality. And I discovered that this is a journey so many queer people with religious backgrounds go through. And so the book is about how we as queer people, if we decide to remain in the Christian faith, how we can bring the fullness of queerness into that. Not just queerness based on who we have sex with or our gender identity, but queerness as opposing all the forces of conformity that are pushing against us in a religious environment. What does it look like to queer a religious community from the ground up? What does it look like to embrace Christian principles for relationships while also recognizing relationships might not be monogamous or between just two people, or all the ways that we have at our disposal as queer people to explore who we are and how we love. And so the book is intended on one hand to push the boundaries and to rile up the Catholic and evangelical apologetics bros who are going to think that it's absolute heresy. But I begin at the front of it by saying the goal is not orthodoxy anymore, and the goal should not be orthodoxy. The goal should not be conformity to the Bible as the end all of our faith. That has never been what Christianity was about. And so I actually think that by embracing queerness and bringing the queerness of the queer community to the Christian faith, we're actually reclaiming and unearthing the queerness of the original Jesus movement in many ways. And so I hope the book's an invitation to both queer people and to our allies to rethink what it means to be Christian, to rethink what it means to engage the Bible, and to be freed from the constraints of conformity that evangelical, Catholic, Orthodox communities are always pushing as a matter of salvation, because our salvation lies outside of conformity, not within the four walls of it.
And so this book kind of sounds like a bookend to 10 years of kind of working in the queer Christian space.
Yeah.
What do you hope the next 10 years of your work will be like?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in this PhD program, and I would really like to. The biggest thing that I've learned in academia is that this stuff that I talk about online and that we've all engaged with about like queer theology has been well known by a majority of scholars in the space for 50 years. Most biblical scholars have known for 50 years that the Bible doesn't condemn homosexuality, at least not the modern loving consensual kind that we have today. But most people don't know that because it's locked up in academia and it never makes it out. And so I would love to be a professor someday, but also my focus is going to be taking all of this stuff I've been privileged to learn in these hallowed halls of academia and sharing it with the general public, because clearly there's a hunger for it. Again, Jordan Peterson's a great example of somebody who might not be the greatest intellectual in the world, but has good content. People will listen to him lecture for 2 hours. Clearly, people want to learn. There's a hunger for learning. And if we can create content where we're actually giving people this stuff that scholars have known for 50 years, I think the more we can educate folks and help folks reclaim what has been kept from them, the more liberation we'll find, the more we can reform religion, the more political reform we'll see. And so I just want to figure out ways to keep doing that.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. And where can people connect with you and get ready for when your book releases?
Yeah, the best way, if you go to queerchristian.org, you can learn all about the book, and all of my social media is linked there as well. So follow along there. But I really appreciate you making time to have me on today.
Awesome. Thank you.